In the middle of the Pacific's most decisive naval clash, a Japanese strike force locates an American aircraft carrier. They pound it with dive bombers, leaving the ship burning, crippled, and dead in the water. The pilots return, confidently reporting its destruction. Hours later, a second Japanese strike wave hunts the remaining American forces. They discover an apparently untouched carrier cutting through the waves at high speed and launch a brutal second attack. But here is the central mystery of the battle. How could highly trained Japanese pilots attack a single American carrier twice in one day and remain absolutely certain they were destroying two completely different ships? This wasn't a phantom vessel, and this isn't a myth about an unsinkable ship. The target of both of those devastating strikes was the USS Yorktown. What happened on June 4th, 1942, was a collision between Japanese tactical confidence and an unprecedented level of American damage control. The Japanese command made their strategic calculations based on exactly what their pilots saw: massive explosions, towering columns of black smoke, and a crippled hull left completely dead in the water. By all conventional logic of naval warfare, a carrier absorbing that kind of punishment is finished. But beneath the flight deck, hidden from the sky, a different kind of war was being fought. In suffocating darkness, surrounded by ruptured steam lines and flooding compartments, American damage control parties worked with a desperate, mechanical fury. They weren't just putting out fires, they were fighting the clock. Their sole objective was to erase the physical evidence of a fatal strike just fast enough to get the boilers lit and the ship moving again. This invisible labor completely fractured the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. The Imperial Navy was making critical decisions based on a timeline that the Yorktown's crew had already rewritten. The engineers patched their ships so rapidly that when the next wave of Japanese bombers arrived, they saw a functioning carrier making 20 knots. They logically assumed it had to be a fresh target. They were reacting to a tactical illusion, engineered through sheer human endurance. Yet this deadly distortion at Midway didn't begin in June. To understand how the Yorktown managed to deceive the most powerful strike force in the world, we have to rewind the clock exactly 1 month. We have to go back to the first time the Japanese believed they had sent this exact same carrier to the bottom of the Pacific. May 8th, 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea. It is the first naval engagement in history where opposing fleets never see each other, fighting entirely through over-the-horizon aircraft strikes. During the chaotic climax of the battle, a Japanese 800-pound armor-piercing bomb finds the flight deck of the USS Yorktown. It punches cleanly through the steel, plunging 4 decks deep before detonating in the ship's aviation storeroom. The explosion is catastrophic. It instantly kills 66 men, severs vital communication lines, and ignites fierce, uncontrollable fires deep in the ship's belly. For the Japanese aviators circling above the thick black smoke, the visual confirmation is absolute. They see a blackened, burning American carrier that is momentarily dead in the water. When the after-action reports from Coral Sea reach the Imperial Japanese Navy High Command, the strategic math of the Pacific War is confidently updated. Even if the Yorktown hasn't slipped beneath the waves, the sheer kinetic trauma of an 800-pound bomb exploding that deep inside a hull means she is functionally dead. Aircraft carriers are highly volatile platforms, packed with aviation fuel and ordnance. A deep internal fire usually equates to terminal structural failure. To Tokyo, the American Pacific Fleet is now permanently crippled. The Yorktown will require major shipyard facilities, likely a slow, highly vulnerable tow all the way to the west coast of the United States, and months of complex, painstaking reconstruction. For the upcoming summer offensive, the Japanese strike planners simply erase her from the board. But beneath the smoke, the Yorktown refuses to die. Through relentless, heroic damage control, her crew manages to extinguish the fires and restore just enough power to clear the combat zone. Still, she is a floating wreck. Her hull is ruptured, her internal bulkheads are warped from the immense heat of the explosion, and she is bleeding a massive oil slick across the Pacific. She creeps slowly toward Hawaii, essentially a wounded animal trailing blood in the water. While she limps across the ocean, the strategic reality in the Pacific violently accelerates. In the windowless basement of Pearl Harbor, codebreakers led by Commander Joe Rochefort have decisively penetrated the Japanese JN-25 naval cipher. The intercepted messages reveal a massive, complex enemy operation aimed at a tiny, highly strategic atoll called Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is bringing the Kido Butai, the elite Japanese carrier strike force, featuring 4 veteran fleet carriers to crush what remains of American naval power and force a final, decisive battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, looks at his available assets. It is a terrifyingly short list. He has the USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. That is it. 2 carriers against 4. It is a tactical mismatch that borders on a suicide mission. Nimitz knows that a 2-carrier task force will be completely overwhelmed by the combined air groups of the Japanese fleet. He desperately needs a 3rd flight deck. He needs a 3rd air group to balance the lethal geometry of the coming battle. He needs the Yorktown. On the afternoon of May 27, 1942, the battered Yorktown finally slides into Pearl Harbor. She looks exactly like a ship that has barely survived a slaughter. Her armor is scorched, her flight deck is visibly scarred, and the lingering smell of burned fuel, melted wiring, and death still clings to her lower decks. She is maneuvered directly into dry dock number 1. Before the water is even fully pumped out of the massive concrete basin, Admiral Nimitz is there. He doesn't wait for a sanitized engineering report in a comfortable briefing room. He puts on high rubber waders and personally climbs down into the flooded, debris-choked dry dock to inspect the massive hole in the carrier's hull alongside the yard engineers. The initial assessment from the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard experts is bleak, but entirely aligned with standard naval engineering reality. To properly repair the structural integrity of a 25,000-ton warship, they must replace severed load-bearing beams, perfectly relay the flight deck, fix the shattered elevators, and restore the internal power grid to strict Navy safety regulations. Doing this requires precision, heavy materials, and time. The official engineering estimate is 90 days, 3 months of intensive, highly skilled shipyard labor. Nimitz looks at the engineers. He doesn't have 90 days. He doesn't even have 30 days. Based on Rochefort's intelligence intercepts, the Japanese strike force is already steaming across the Pacific. The ambush at Midway has to happen almost immediately. Nimitz delivers an order that completely shatters standard naval engineering protocols. He tells the yardmaster that he must have the Yorktown back. Not in 3 months, in 3 days. The engineers are stunned. It is a physical impossibility. You cannot weld that much steel, replace that much wiring, and secure that much structural framing in 72 hours. But Nimitz's demand fundamentally changes the entire nature of the operation. This is no longer a repair job. It is a battlefield triage. The standard operating procedures, the safety regulations, and the long-term structural concerns are immediately thrown out the window. The objective is violently narrowed down to a single, brutal question. What is the absolute minimum amount of work required to make this ship launch and recover aircraft without sinking? If a bulkhead is severely bent but holding back the sea, leave it bent. If a corridor is scorched to the steel and smells of ash, leave it dark. Fix the boilers so she can generate steam and move. Patch the underwater hull so she doesn't flood and capsize. Repair the flight deck so heavy dive bombers can roll across it without collapsing into the decks below. Everything else, every non-essential system, every cosmetic fix, every internal repair that doesn't directly contribute to launching a plane or turning a propeller is completely ignored. Within minutes of Nimitz's order, a small army descends upon the crippled carrier. Over 1,400 civilian shipyard workers and naval mechanics flood the decks of the Yorktown. They don't operate in shifts. They operate in a continuous, unbroken swarm of humanity. The dry dock becomes a blinding, deafening feeder of sparks and noise. Honolulu actually experiences rolling power brownouts because the Navy Yard is pulling so much electricity to run hundreds of arc welders simultaneously. Men work in suffocating temperatures deep inside the unventilated hull, breathing in toxic fumes from burning lead paint and welding gas. When they collapse from heat exhaustion, they are dragged up to the hangar deck, revived with water, and immediately sent back down into the belly of the ship. There is no time to source and shape prefabricated steel plates, so they cut away steel from other damaged ships still resting in the harbor and weld it directly over Yorktown's wounds. The repairs are ugly, jagged, and strictly functional. The ship vibrates with the constant bone-rattling roar of pneumatic hammers and acetylene torches cutting through metal. Every passing hour pushes the men closer to the absolute limits of human endurance. They are not restoring a pristine warship for a long deployment. They are resurrecting a zombie carrier, Frankensteining her broken combat systems together with raw muscle and sheer desperation. The clock is no longer measured in weeks or days. It is measured in hours. The Japanese fleet is steadily closing in on Midway, entirely confident they are sailing toward a severely weakened enemy, unaware that inside a blazing, smoke-filled dry dock in Hawaii, the dead are being forced back to life. On the morning of May 30th, just 3 days after limping into dry dock number 1, the USS Yorktown is refloated. She is an entirely different kind of vessel now. She isn't fully repaired, she is merely held together. Her hull is sealed with crude, heavy patches of scavenged steel, hastily welded over the ruptured plates. Deep inside her lower decks, the intense, lingering smell of charred electrical insulation and scorched metal still hangs in the humid air, a constant, physical reminder of the violence she barely survived. Dozens of civilian yard workers are still aboard, their arc welders throwing showers of sparks across the hangar deck, desperately trying to finish critical structural bracing as the massive ship physically pulls away from the pier. The Yorktown is underway. She clears the anti-submarine nets of Pearl Harbor and sets a course to the northwest, rushing to rendezvous with the Enterprise and Hornet at Point Luck. Her departure from Hawaii is the critical variable that the Japanese High Command has entirely failed to anticipate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his elite carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, are advancing across the Pacific with absolute strategic confidence. Their entire operational timeline, their disposition of forces, and their tactical expectations are built upon a singular foundational assumption. The American carrier fleet has been permanently crippled at the Battle of the Coral Sea. They firmly believe they are sailing to face, at most, 2 American flight decks. They do not know that Admiral Nimitz has essentially conjured a third carrier out of thin air through 72 hours of sheer, desperate industrial violence. The Japanese are bringing their finest aviators to execute an ambush against a weakened enemy, completely unaware that they are sailing directly into a heavily reinforced trap. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, that trap violently snaps shut. In a catastrophic sequence of events that shatters the strategic balance of the Pacific War, American dive bombers plunge from the clouds over the Japanese fleet. In roughly 5 minutes of devastating precision, they ignite towering infernos aboard the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy is reduced to burning, twisting wreckage. The massive, synchronized striking power of the Kido Butai is instantly broken, but the battle is not over. Steaming rapidly away from the burning wreckage of her sister ships is the Hiryu. She is the 4th Japanese carrier, and she is completely untouched. Aboard her bridge, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, a fierce, aggressive commander, assesses the sudden, apocalyptic disaster. He is now the sole surviving commander of a functional Japanese flight deck. He has lost the element of surprise. He has lost his overwhelming numerical advantage, but he still possesses a lethal complement of veteran dive bombers and torpedo planes. He orders an immediate, desperate counterstrike to locate and destroy the American forces that have just annihilated his fleet. The pilots of the Hiryu launch into the sky, burning with the desire for retaliation. They are flying to avenge their devastated comrades, operating under the absolute conviction that they are hunting the Enterprise or the Hornet. They scan the horizon, desperate to find the American carriers that have shattered their invincible armada. When they finally spot the wake of an American carrier cutting through the deep blue water, they push their aircraft into a steep, aggressive dive. The Japanese pilots lock their sights onto the massive flight deck below, preparing to deliver the fatal blow to the remaining American naval power. They have no idea that the ship, steadily growing larger in their crosshairs, is the USS Yorktown. They are initiating a brutal, high-stakes duel with a ghost ship, a vessel that their own high command officially erased from the war a month ago, and one that is about to suffer its second death. The 18 dive bombers from the Hiryu break through the scattered clouds, their engines screaming as they plunge toward the target. Anti-aircraft fire erupts from the Yorktown and her escorting cruisers, filling the sky with deadly black flak bursts, but the Japanese pilots pressed the attack with terrifying precision. At 12:11 p.m., the first 550-pound bomb slams into the carrier. It strikes just aft of the midships elevator, ripping through the wooden flight deck and exploding violently in the hangar below, instantly igniting fires among parked aircraft and fueling hoses. Seconds later, a second bomb pierces the flight deck, plunging deep into the ship's lower levels, before detonating inside the uptakes for the boiler exhausts. This hit is catastrophic. It ruptures the massive brick linings of the boiler furnaces, instantly extinguishing the fires that generate the ship's steam power. Thick, choking black smoke violently erupts from the carrier's smokestack, billowing hundreds of feet into the air. A third bomb strikes the forward elevator, blowing a massive hole in the deck and sparking more fires. Inside the Yorktown, the damage is severe. The ship shudders violently. With the boilers knocked out, the massive turbines lose steam pressure. The carrier's speed drops rapidly from over 25 knots to a crawl, and then completely stops. The Yorktown is dead in the water. She sits motionless on the Pacific, a massive, vulnerable target, trailing a thick column of black smoke that is visible for miles. High above, the surviving Japanese pilots pull out of their dives and assess the damage. What they see perfectly aligns with their training and experience. A carrier that has taken 3 direct bomb hits, has lost all forward momentum, and is belching heavy black smoke is a functionally destroyed asset. It cannot launch or recover aircraft. It cannot evade submarine attacks. It is a sitting duck. The flight leader radios back to the Hiryu, confidently reporting that they have heavily damaged and likely neutralized an American aircraft carrier. Aboard the Hiryu, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi receives the report. It is a moment of grim satisfaction amidst a day of unprecedented disaster. He has lost 3 carriers, but his pilots have just taken one of the American flight decks out of the equation. If the initial intelligence reports were correct, the Americans only brought 2 carriers to this fight. By neutralizing one, Yamaguchi believes he has just leveled the playing field. The odds are now 1 against 1. The battle, though incredibly costly, is not yet lost. He immediately orders his second strike wave, the torpedo bombers, to prepare for launch. Their mission is clear: find the second untouched American carrier and sink it. But Yamaguchi's renewed confidence is built entirely on the assumption that the ship his dive bombers just struck will remain a smoking ruin. He does not account for the sheer mechanical fury of American damage control. Deep inside the dark, suffocating lower decks of the Yorktown, the scene is chaotic, but it is a highly organized chaos. The damage control teams don't wait for orders from the bridge. They immediately execute the brutal triage protocols they had perfected during the desperate repairs in Pearl Harbor. Men wearing heavy asbestos suits and breathing apparatus plunge into the smoke-filled hangar deck, dragging heavy hoses to fight the aviation fuel fires. They manually close massive steel watertight doors to isolate the flooding. Down in the boiler rooms, the heat is unbearable, easily exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is thick with soot and the smell of ruptured fuel lines. Chief Water Tender Charles Kleinsmith, despite severe burns and toxic smoke, leads his men in a desperate attempt to patch the ruptured boiler uptakes. They manually reroute steam valves, bypass shattered pipes, and fight to reignite the massive furnaces. It is grueling, invisible labor, completely hidden from the Japanese scout planes still circling miles away. They are not just fighting fires, they are fighting the clock. Every minute the Yorktown sits dead in the water, she is vulnerable to a finishing blow. The American mechanics work with a speed that defies conventional engineering logic. Within an hour of the attack, the fires on the hangar deck are aggressively contained. The massive holes in the flight deck are hastily covered with heavy steel plates and lumber, creating a crude but functional surface for aircraft operations. And then the impossible happens. Deep in the belly of the ship, the engineers manage to reignite several of the boilers. Slowly, steam pressure builds. The massive turbines begin to turn. The Yorktown shudders, and the propellers bite into the water. The ship begins to move, first at 5 knots, then 10, then 15. Above deck, the transformation is dramatic. The thick, black smoke that had marked the ship as a dying wreck slowly dissipates, replaced by a steady stream of gray exhaust. The list is corrected. The flight deck is clear. To an observer thousands of feet above, the visual evidence of the crippling dive bomber's strike is being systematically erased. By 1:40 p.m., just an hour and a half after taking 3 devastating bomb hits. The Yorktown is cutting through the Pacific at nearly 20 knots. She is launching and recovering fighter patrols. She is, to all outward appearances, a fully functional fleet carrier. At that exact moment, the second strike wave from the Hiryu, 10 Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 0 fighters, is closing in on the American fleet. The Japanese pilots have been briefed that 1 American carrier is already burning and dead in the water. They are actively hunting for the second, pristine carrier. They fly through scattered clouds, their eyes scanning the vast expanse of the ocean. Suddenly, they spot the distinct wake of a large warship. As they draw closer, the silhouette of an aircraft carrier emerges from the haze. The Japanese flight leader analyzes the target. The ship is moving at high speed, executing evasive maneuvers. The flight deck appears clean, launching aircraft. There is no towering column of black smoke, no severe list, no visual signature of a mortally wounded vessel. Based on everything the pilots see, and everything they have been told, the tactical conclusion is absolute. This cannot be the ship they struck 2 hours ago. That ship was a crippled, smoking ruin left far behind. Therefore, this pristine, fast-moving vessel must be the second American carrier. It must be the Enterprise or the Hornet. The Japanese pilots tighten their grips on their controls, lock their sights onto the fast-moving target, and push their torpedo bombers into a low, aggressive attack run. They are absolutely certain they are about to deliver a crippling blow to the remaining strength of the American fleet. The Japanese torpedo bombers drop low over the water, skimming the waves to evade the intense anti-aircraft fire, throwing up geysers around them. They are executing a textbook attack against what they believe is the second American carrier, a fresh, undamaged target. They release their Type 91 torpedoes, watching the deadly steel cylinders splash into the Pacific and arm themselves. On the bridge of the USS Yorktown, the situation is instantly recognized as fatal. Evasive maneuvers are ordered, the massive ship banking hard, but she cannot turn fast enough to outrun the underwater spread. At 2:42 p.m., 2 torpedoes slam into her port side in rapid succession. The concussions are massive, fundamentally different from the bomb hits earlier in the day. Instead of tearing downward through the decks, the torpedoes fracture the hull from the outside, violently breaking the ship's watertight integrity below the waterline. The ocean rushes in with terrifying force. The Yorktown immediately loses all power. The turbines grind to a halt. The ship's internal lighting flickers and dies, plunging the lower decks into suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the frantic beams of battle lanterns. Unlike the earlier dive bomber attack, where damage control teams could fight fires and patch uptakes, there is no quick engineering fix for a massive rupture in the lower hull. The ship immediately takes on a severe 23-degree list to port. The flight deck tilts at a sharp, unnatural angle, making it nearly impossible for the crew to stand upright without holding onto the bulkheads. Down in the engine rooms, the situation is critical. The massive generators are dead. Without power, the pumps cannot fight the catastrophic flooding. The ship is slowly, inexorably rolling over. Captain Elliot Buckmaster assesses the critical loss of buoyancy and the dead power grid. The ship is highly vulnerable, motionless, and bleeding heavily into the Pacific. Fearing that the carrier is about to capsize and drag her crew down with her, Buckmaster makes the hardest decision a naval commander can face. At 2:55 p.m., he gives the order to abandon ship. Men slide down ropes into the oily water, abandoning the vessel they had just miraculously resurrected. As evening falls on June 4th, the Yorktown is left behind, a dark, silent silhouette listing heavily against the horizon. The crew watches her from rescue destroyers, anticipating that the battered steel giant will finally slip beneath the waves before dawn. Her incredible run of survival appears completely over. But morning broke on June 5th with an incredible sight. The massive carrier was still there, despite taking 2 heavy torpedoes to the port side, enlisting so severely that her flight deck nearly touched the water. The USS Yorktown refused to capsize. The engineering and structural integrity of the ship, combined with the frantic, calculated damage control efforts from the previous day, had somehow stabilized her buoyancy. She was a crippled giant, dead in the water, completely abandoned by her crew, but she was stubbornly refusing to sink. When dawn illuminated the silent, listing hull, the American command realized they had an unexpected opportunity. The ship hadn't gone down in the night. Perhaps she didn't have to go down at all. A massive salvage operation was quickly organized. The fleet tug USS Vireo was dispatched to secure a tow line, attempting to slowly pull the massive, unwieldy carrier away from the combat zone. A volunteer salvage crew of 141 men, engineers, mechanics, and damage control specialists, Robert back to the Yorktown and climbed the sloping flight deck. Their task was incredibly dangerous. They had to operate in the dark, flooded compartments of a heavily listing ship, trying to pump out thousands of tons of seawater to correct the severe tilt. They dragged portable gasoline-powered pumps across the tilted deck, desperately trying to counterbalance the flooding. For hours, they fought a grueling battle against the Pacific. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to make progress. The extreme list was reduced by 2 degrees, then a few more. Hope began to spread through the salvage crew and the escorting destroyers. Against all conventional logic, after surviving the bomb hit at Coral Sea, the desperate 3-day triage in Pearl Harbor, the devastating dive bomber strike, and 2 torpedo hits, it looked like they were actually going to save the Yorktown. But the ocean is vast, and the Japanese Navy still had assets hunting in the area. While the salvage crew focused intensely on the flooded lower decks, a silent threat was maneuvering into position beneath the waves. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had slipped past the American defensive screen. Tanabe had been ordered to bombard Midway Atoll, but his mission quickly changed when he received reports of a crippled American carrier in the vicinity. For hours, I-168 crept closer, navigating through the acoustic clutter of the escorting destroyers. Tanabe carefully aligned his submarine, completely undetected by the American sonar operators, who were distracted by the noise of the salvage operation and the heavy tow lines. The Yorktown, moving at a barely perceptible crawl behind the tugboat, was a massive, helpless target. At 1:31 p.m. on June 6th, Tanabe fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. The salvage crew on the Yorktown's deck barely had time to shout a warning when the wakes were spotted streaking toward the starboard side. 1 torpedo missed entirely. Another slammed directly into the USS Hammond, a destroyer tied alongside the Yorktown to provide electrical power for the salvage pumps. The Hammond was instantly broken in half by the explosion and sank in less than 4 minutes, taking many of her crew with her. The remaining 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown precisely amidships on her starboard side. The massive explosions shattered the fragile stabilization the salvage crew had fought so hard to achieve. The heavy shockwaves threw men across the tilted deck and ruptured the hull yet again. The carrier shuddered violently, absorbing the massive kinetic impact, but miraculously, she didn't instantly roll over. Even after this final devastating blow, the Yorktown remained on the surface, a testament to her incredibly resilient construction. But the salvage operation was over. The damage was now catastrophic and irreversible. The remaining crew was forced to abandon ship for the second time. The Yorktown lingered through the night, a silent, dark shape on the Pacific, slowly losing her final battle with the sea. At 4:58 a.m. on the morning of June 7th, the USS Yorktown finally surrendered. She rolled heavily to port, revealing the massive torpedo wounds in her hull, and slipped stern first beneath the Pacific. She was not a mythical, unsinkable ship. Steel eventually yields to the relentless physics of the ocean. But the true legacy of the Yorktown isn't found in her ability to survive indefinitely. It is found in exactly how much time she managed to steal before she went down. Over a span of just 30 days, this single vessel completely dismantled the tactical reality of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By dragging her shattered hull out of the Coral Sea, she broke Tokyo's pre-battle mathematics. By surviving that brutal 72-hour resurrection in Pearl Harbor, she provided the critical third flight deck Admiral Nimitz desperately needed to launch his ambush. And by absorbing that catastrophic dive bomber attack on June 4th, only to shake off the smoke and steam forward at 20 knots, her crew engineered the most devastating deception of the entire battle. The Japanese pilots did not fail in their marksmanship. They struck their target with lethal precision, twice. But because the American damage control parties fought with such ferocious speed to erase the visible scars of the first strike, the Japanese command was tricked into a fatal assumption. They calculated that they were facing a multi-carrier threat and spent the last of their elite aviation strength trying to kill a ghost. Admiral Yamaguchi poured the entire retaliatory power of the Hiryu into finishing off a ship that was already functionally doomed, absolutely convinced he was taking a second, pristine American carrier off the board. That fatal miscalculation, born entirely from the blood, sweat, and wrenches of mechanics in a dark, suffocating boiler room, became the deadliest weapon at Midway. While the Imperial Navy remained obsessively fixated on the Yorktown, frantically trying to sink the same carrier over and over again, they left their own forces exposed. The Japanese had committed everything to the illusion. They never noticed the American dive bombers from the unbothered Enterprise and Hornet plunging out of the afternoon sun, finding the Hiryu and wiping the final Japanese flight deck from the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy spent the absolute peak of its striking power, hunting a ghost it had already killed. When the USS Yorktown finally settled into the freezing depths of the Pacific, it took with it the myth of Japanese naval invincibility. She was a broken, patched-together ship that refused to die on the enemy's schedule. By absorbing those critical strikes, her crew of mechanics, damage controlmen, and engineers didn't just save their vessel for a few extra hours. They bought the exact margin of time required to win the most decisive naval battle of the war. The Yorktown could not survive Midway, but by forcing the Japanese to kill her twice, she made absolutely certain the Imperial fleet wouldn't survive it either.